pleased to introduce you to one of the premier events at the Indo-American Arts Council Lit Fest. The IAAC is a 501c3 nonprofit organization dedicated to promoting, showcasing, and building an awareness of arts and artists of Asian and Indian heritage and diaspora. Artistic focus is primarily on the performing arts besides the visual and folk arts. So there's a big dance festival and there's a film festival, and you can find out more at www.iaac.us. And the Fest is happening from December 4th to December 12th, 2021. There are a couple of live in-person events on December 4th at the Delhi Art Gallery in the Fuller Building in New York City. And then on December 4th, there's a live poetry event. And on December 12th, the actor and memoirist Cal Penn will be performing. And then in the interim, we have a number of terrific virtual panels, including this one. And I'm really looking forward to this discussion of Shreela Ray, one of the lost masters. And I'm really pleased to introduce our panel today. The panel is going to be moderated by Caitlin Rizzo, a writer, researcher, and translator who was born and raised in Florida. She currently lives in Texas, where she's poetry editor for Gulf Coast and the graduate for the undergraduate journal Glass Mountain, and a master's candidate at the University of Houston's Creative Writing Program. Then we also have with Caitlin, Rohan Chhetri, a writer and translator. He's the author of Slow Startle, which won the Emerging Poets Prize in 2015, Jurassic Desire, and the forthcoming, I think it is out now, Lost Hurt or In Transit Beautiful. A UK edition is coming out from Platypus Press, and he, of course, along with Kazim, edited Shreela Ray on the life and work of an American master, and he's also the recipient of a 2021 Penn Heim Grant for translation, and his poems have appeared in the Paris Review, Review Europe, Agni, the New England Review, and elsewhere, and also been translated into Greek and French. And they will both be joined by Kazim Ali, who was born in the UK and has lived transnationally. He has numerous books that encompass genres, including the volumes of poetry, The Voice of Sheila Chandra, Inquisition, All One's Blue, Skyward, The 40th Day, The Far Mosque, which was the winner of the Alice James book, New England, New York Award, and the cross-genre text, Bright Felon and Wind Instrument. His most recent book is Northern Light, Power, Land, and the Memory of Water, just out. What a prolific year Kazim has had, which Literary Hub called A Balm for the Soul. And he's also a novelist. His novels include The Secret Room, A String Quartet, and he is also an essayist of the hybrid memoir Silver Road, Essays, Maps, and Calligraphies, and Fasting for Ramadan, Notes from a Spiritual Practice. In addition, he's an accomplished translator. He's translated Marguerite Duras, Anandina Devi, Mohammad Chokralahi, and many others, and is the editor of several anthologies and books of criticism. So it's an enormous treat to have all three of you talk about someone who many of us might not know about. And as you say, there's a kind of secret history to this unsung master. So please, Caitlin, take it away.
Thank you so much, Ravi. It's an honor to be in this room with such a star-studded cast. And I am going to turn it over to Kazim to introduce the work of Shreela Ray and read us a couple of poems just to get that utterance in and have our audience be a little more familiar.
Thank you so much, Caitlin and Ravi, and everybody who's here. Thanks for being here. And of course, thank you to IAAC for putting on this great event and including us. Shreela Ray was born in 1942 in what was then called Orissa province. And she came to the United States at age 18 for college. And besides a few visits home, she never really went back to India, except, as I said, as a visitor. She lived her life in the United States. She became a poet young, and she was quite successful. She published in Poetry Magazine as early as 1966. She attended Breadloaf. She knew Auden. She knew Robert Frost. She knew John Berryman, William Meredith, Isabella Gardner, Galway Kinnell. She studied with Leslie Fiedler at the University of Buffalo, where she did a master's degree, so she was quite well known and quite successful. But as happens, perhaps with many poets in general, but in particular women of color at the time, she was one of the few women of color, and in particular Asian American women, who was publishing. And so she did have a family. She published one and only one book called Night Conversations with None Other in 1977. And she wrote the rest of her life, but she never published another book. And she even published a few poems in journals here and there, but mostly she was not publishing. She died prematurely at age 52 in 1994. And, by the time I was in my master's degree program in 1999 at NYU, she was all but forgotten, and has remained so. Because when I was a junior high student outside Buffalo, New York, many of the local poets knew Shreela and knew her work and were teaching her work in classes. So I read her poems for the first time when I was 13 years old, and they've haunted me ever since. And so the Unsung Masters series is a series that's devoted to bringing back into print writers who have been forgotten. So I'm just going to read 3 short poems from this book by Shreela, and then just say a couple more short things. This is a poem called Letter Home, and it perhaps speaks to, even though she stayed in America for the balance of her life, it perhaps speaks to the profound loneliness she had for India, her homesickness. And it's interesting, these poems, since she was from a climate, a tropical climate, literally, the winter that appears in these poems. This poem is called Letter Home. As the outward signs of winter leave us, the purple crocus springs up in the neighbor's yard, and on the pavement, pieces of broken beds and picture frames lie in a heap. Your life is marked with no lesser executions: heat, rain, ice, births and broken wrists, imagined and not imagined. From time to time, let me hear from you. In June, I shall sit for the examinations. There's talk of marriage in December. But if word of me arrives during the rain and the rivers turn gray, I send my bitter angel to guide you, and let your letter say, we have lost the records of your birth and departure. Nobody misses you in Bhubaneswar. That poem has an interesting counterpoint in Agha Shahid Ali's poem Dear Shahid, which is a little prose poem that's at the heart of his collection Country Without a Post Office, which similarly speaks to that. It's in the voice of someone he left behind in the old country. The second poem that I want to read to you also speaks of that loss and nostalgia, but in a way, Shreela might be coming to terms with being an alien in the new country. And it's got this very kind of typical, which I love actually, this typical kind of setting for this poem, which is the migrant from the hot place being in the northern United States. In this case, Shreela was in Rochester, New York, but really experiencing the cold winter for the first time. If you've read Jhumpa Lahiri's book, The Namesake, or seen the film version of it, there is a scene just like that where the mother of the title character has come from India, and the husband is doing his PhD in Minneapolis at the University of Minnesota, and she's just freezing in the apartment. He goes off to school, and she's freezing in the apartment. She's in the kitchen rummaging around trying to find something to eat, and she's so cold. There's a scene in Mina Alexander's memoir Fault Lines that's almost precisely the same, almost the same situation too, because the husband too is doing his PhD at the University of Minnesota, and Mina is left behind in the apartment, and she has a metal trash can. If you've read Fault Lines, you know the story. And she decides to start a fire in the metal trash can to stay warm. So this, things don't go well in that situation. But this poem is also a poem that's set in a kitchen, and it's set during the winter. It's so cold. And what's really interesting to me is this poem was written and published in a journal in the 60s. It mentions Hemant Kumar. It's called A Miniature for Hemant Kumar. I don't know, I think it's probably an American popular culture, the first appearance of a South Asian cultural, like pop cultural figure. I think, I don't know, this was like before Ravi Shankar, the other Ravi Shankar, became really famous here with the Beatles and everything. It was pre all of that, So this might be the first time. And I also think it might be the first appearance in American poetry of a subcontinental landscape written by an author from that place, so although that comes in at the very end. So this is a miniature for Hemant Kumar, and her relationship to home is changing here. The March snow is with us between the two stalled maples. Its rude white silence glitters. I will not come to terms. I back up, the glass behind me breaks, ropes of red onions scatter on the floor, but I never take my eyes off and retreat. Your pure voice, Hemant Kumar, that once could drug my peevish self and make me move, once in the sunlight, once in the evening, like a dancer keens for an alien. Hi, Babu. I should care if the sun warms the fields and Radha's feet, or that spring comes again to Kashi and Vrindavan. So there is sadness in that poem as well, but not quite the same longing. She's actually letting go. She's letting go of the dream of being able to go back, of having, those warm fields again. And then this last poem that I'll read, I think she makes some kind of assertion of belonging to the new place. And it's called Night in April. The voice of the April wind addresses the unmarriageable, awake in the real sleep of the body. The windows are open and the sleepy violets of the blood stir toward the dark outside. Final nakedness in the silhouettes of doorways and branches, ascending and descending. To stay would mean for always I would remain to weigh and measure. Let your breath inflame a second marriage for that end. As for me, there is some other livelihood when the essences of things call me sister. Before I draw back my wings and fall into the keel of bird-like flowers, by God, I will make a garden of this place. Thank you. I'll come back in the Q&A and we'll talk more, but that's it for my reading and presentation.
That was so gorgeous. I love that poem, that end poem. It's everything about it. Rohan, we're going to turn over to you for a moment to read some of your favorites of Shreela Ray and bring us into that space.
Thank you, Caitlin, and thank you, Kazim, for such a beautiful reading of those three poems, which bring in so many of the themes that her poems are rife with. The notion of severance through immigration, the letting go that you talked about, the wanting to make a garden out of this place, at the same time, the tug of home. So many other things. The poem I think I'll be reading today is a poem for Gawain, because it does this beautiful thing where the anxiety of an exile now transfers, is kind of projected onto the second generation, the child who was born in America, and she is what he is predestined for in this country, and in this barbaric country, according to her, in a way with so she's definitely at this point in at this point in time, responding to all of the political crises that are happening at that point in time where America is complicit. And so this is a kind of weaving through, speaking to our own son, a part love song to our own son, and a part sort of instruction manual, which kind of takes talk of how he should live in this country and what he should do. Poem for Gawain. Half-breed child, you are the color of earth, limbs of trees and deep rivers. Only in them can you find sanctuary. You remind me of my country, its divisions, its inalterable destiny, the white sands of Puri turning red, the Deccan, a tableland for scavengers. I would like to save you, to search for a second home. There is none, because we are the poor and the elders of the earth. So use my body as a shield, and behind its metal sing of the dark. So when death comes, you will think it is the sea. In this casket, this body, lie on it, warm, familiar, as though you were in your own room, in your own bed. 2. If you should find yourself one day in love with a Chinese girl in a cafe in Paris, do not tell her to stay with her own people, even tenderly. Follow her home, stand under her window in the rain, but on no account give her $5 and send her off in a taxi. She may have more sense and decide to go on living anyway. And if you should meet Aristophanes, first ask him, when a man goes in search of his sundered female half, must she be of the same race? 3. I stand in the heartland. From the south, the ocean breaks in. The desert blows towards the center. I do not know what to call it, suicide or murder, or the natural course of things when the wretched fall upon the wretched, or guns or for bread. I will write this story for you on a tortoise shell comb, where the song becomes something old and slow and hidden in the carapace of your tiny mortality. 4. What will you do? You are the gold around my neck, star. Learn American English, live long and be strong and gun your mother down. 5. My father was buried alive in the paddy fields by his International Harvester tractor. When they dug him out, his face was calm and he seemed to be smiling. How could I be sure that mud hadn't transformed his mouth and that the juice and grass of his land hadn't masked his face? For 13 years, I have carried dead fathers, grandfathers, uncles, and the virgin halves of myself in search of friendly ground. Even the graveyards have no entry for Marxist poets. So I buried them all in my head. 6. Mist in the morning and mist hands below me, loading and reloading mysterious shipments from the east. Not the ancient commodities, cloves and silk, but the heavy stuff for the dinners and security of the United States of America. I start thinking about God at a time like this. Above all things, in a place like this, I think Bellona Christ is the greatest of gods. He has even joined the Israelites. All we ask of Buddha is that he lie on his side so we can carve lotus blossoms on the soles of his feet. I will speak of this always, sometimes as we watch for the dawn and the paper, and I see the red and blue flag with its one white star I cut with my own hands, wrap itself around our makeshift staff. I cannot tell you enough that I am frightened My life is like the wastelands America leaves behind her, and the people cannot be saved from this by nails or Sabbaths or chemistry. When every new infant is cradled in the jawbone of an ass bleached in the desert. So this is a 6-part poem. What I'm going to do is read a section out where in the essay that I wrote for this book, where I talk about this poem at length. This will be a small part of it. In poem foregoing, part instruction manual, part love poem addressed to her song, which stunningly brings together many of Ray's thematic concerns. She writes to her half-breed child and turns his second-generation immigrant destiny into an allegory of her country's own divisions in alterable destiny. The sequence further explores this theme of division and reinstatement through a dazzling examination of national and cultural trauma. The historical rift created between the Hindus and the Muslims during partition is posited as an allegory for the trauma of division inherent in the immigrant consciousness. In the second part of the poem, this metaphor extends towards love by the Aristophanes myth of the round people as described by Plato in Symposium. The myth states we are forever looking for the severed halves of ourselves, longing for a prior wholeness, a longing stemming from a recognition of an inherent lack when faced with the condition of eros. Shreela Ray writes in repudiation of this allegory of love in an effort to revise the premise to that of an interracial relationship. And if you should meet Aristophanes first, ask him, she says, when a man goes in search of his sundered female half, must she be of the same race? In truth, the severance that Ray suffers in migration remains impossible to recover. The struggle to be reinstated to an erstwhile wholeness or roundness, forever left wanting by the inability to return to that first place. This idea of wholeness itself is located in an erotic triangulation to the condition of exile and the fantasy of a parallel, unimmigrated self, a cut branch that might have grown full straight. That's a quote from Marlowe that I stole. She returns to this theme again in the 5th part of the poem. For 13 years, I have carried dead fathers, grandfathers, uncles, and the virgin halves of myself. This is not to say there isn't a dream of an alternate wholeness, a relinquishing of the nameless loss of exile, a letting go, as Kazim Ali mentioned, to finally grow roots and make a garden out of this second place, a gesture towards finding home, whereas Najib Mahfouz writes, all your attempts to escape cease. In the last part of the poem, she writes, sometimes as we watch for the dawn in the paper and I see the red and blue flag with its one white star, I cut with my own hands, wrap itself around our makeshift staff. This scene of suburban domesticity is immediately dislocated by the specter of the Gulf War and the knowledge of her own complicity in the nation's military-industrial complex. In a dazzling collision of the personal and the political, she writes, I am frightened. My life is like the wastelands America leaves behind her. Thus a poem addressed to a young son doesn't evolve into a lullaby, but pivots into a warning, a manual for survival in a warmongering nation whose people cannot be saved from this by nails or Sabbaths or chemistry. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Both of these readings, both of these poems that you point to relay this sense of severance that Ray is reconciling with this terrible American benevolence, right? That she quotes in another poem throughout the work. And I want to talk about this a little bit because the book's title is Shreela Ray on the Life and Work of an Unsung American Master. And both of you come at this collection from very different positionalities, right? Rohan, you grew up in a boarding school very close to where Shreela Ray herself spent the better part of her childhood in Darjeeling. And Kazim, you are deeply familiar with this terrible American benevolence that Ray keeps pointing to, almost like a Cassandra figure, almost to set off these alarm bells in a wider society. Can you talk about the considerations that came with that in the way you approach this anthology?
Yes, I mean, she was on, she was on the outside of various traditions. I mean, she didn't not go back to India because she couldn't. She could, she had the resources to, but there are ways in which she needed and wanted to be on her own and separated in order to, to be free of all of the various social hierarchies that we're intimately familiar with. And the back half of the book is letters. She was a copious letter writer. There were hundreds and hundreds of pages of letters in her files. We reprinted about 100 pages of letters spanning from her earliest arrival in America, where she's writing to her brother from her college dorm room, all the way up to the end of her life. And so she had a complicated relationship. She did want to stay. This was very much her adopted country. When she was questioned about whether or not she was a quote unquote American writer, she wrote a very powerful letter that's in the book where she says, what else am I? I'm nothing else. I mean, I've been here since I was 18. My family is here. My children were born here. I raised them here. I wrote all of my poems here. If I'm not an American writer, then, what am I exactly? I'm paraphrasing what she actually said, but she probably said it more eloquently than me. And in particular, I think she had a growing sense as her own politics developed and as her own, sense of the world developed. We were in the Reagan years in the United States here, and she really became sympathetic with the struggles of, this what was then commonly called the Third World, in particular in solidarity with Palestinian people. She became very suspicious of CIA interventions abroad and a very vocal critic. And I think she also began to develop a sense that her marginalization by the literary establishment of the time, we don't know if she's right or not. I don't know. But I can tell you she herself felt that her political commitments caused people, the publishing establishment and the literary establishment, to turn their backs on her. So she felt keenly persecuted politically as well, although it didn't stop her. I don't know if Rohan, you have something here.
I guess I can speak to my own experience when Shreela, it was so strange to have not read her, to not have encountered her work. So when this opportunity came and I started looking her up and I started reading the few letters that Kazim, you had sent me, and you had sent me the first letter.
Yeah.
And I just couldn't believe that it was a coincidence, but it was such a great coincidence to know that she had studied in Darjeeling, and that she was, because that is something that I walk around with all the time, that comparison to that first place, that first landscape, inner geographical landscape that you grew up in, becomes so important with every mountain you climb, every hike that you take. You're always comparing. And reading Shreela saying that, and particularly in her first few letters, was so interesting to me, and I immediately warmed up to her. It was a very temperamental kind of recognition for me. Of course, then I started reading her poems, and I realized that she was brilliant, and that this was like we had a real, someone on her way to greatness, already great, but also on her way to much deserving greatness, had the circumstances been a little different. Even if she had been publishing now, things would have been much, much different for her in a way. And that idea, that is, I think I bring so much of that in my reading. In my essay, I talk about the first place because of how she returns back to it again and again. And from the first letter that she writes to one of the last letters that we couldn't actually put in the book, letter to Padma, where she talks about the botanical gardens that is the one place that she wants to visit, in Darjeeling, and to understand. I mean, I can quote that part. It is so beautiful. She says, "Most of all, I would love to see the botanical gardens again. Of all the places now, I miss that one." And a little later, "There are so many things to ask you, but what I really want is to see again, to be there, to be witness, be certain of change, to know with the same but changed body the changes in the safest world I once knew." That reads like a prose poem. I mean, it has this amazing lilting, it has this rhythm to it. But apart from that, I guess it really drew me to her to be engaged in her work in a much deeper way than I thought I would be. And I think that was important for me to open up this kind of, and also as a way to open up a kind of a blueprint, or rather a roadmap for me as an artist, as a poet in America, who came to America just like her, who had a similar upbringing in the Catholic schools of Darjeeling. And here we are. And I came when I was 28 years old, and Shreela came 10 years before that when she was 18. So it becomes like a warning and a roadmap. So it's like it becomes this amazing thing to sort of to turn back to look for guidance. So I think in those ways it created such a deep level of engagement for me, a critical engagement as well as, which is very important to work on a project like this, but also a very personal sort of engagement with her work.
Something that you mentioned in terms of how her work feels so out of time when you read it in the context of when it's published in 77. And this aspect of lineage is a question that I have, right? Reading her work today feels so in place, in conversation with everything we are currently discussing in the contemporary, right? These questions of navigation and reassertion of citizenship questions that happened through Marcelo Hernandez and other writers. And I want to ask a little bit about Nina Alexander, who you brought up, this book, and what positionality we see in this lineage, maybe between Nina Alexander, Ritika Vazirani, and Shreela Ray, this generation before, of, and slightly after. Because I think there's a lot of interesting conversations to be had there.
Yeah, 100%. I love that idea. Mina, Shreela, and Ritika are three really interesting people to think about because they were just enough apart, right? Like, so Shreela was born in 1940, Mina in 1951, I think, and then Ritika in 1961. So they're just, a little bit apart from each other. But each of them as individuals came into a landscape of contemporary American poetry that was not prepared for them, and didn't know how to read them necessarily. And what happened was, of course, with Shreela, she was, very much a path breaker. And as Rohan, I noticed this early, Rohan talks about it, and Tishani Doshi in her essay also talks about it. But if you know contemporary Indian poetry, Shreela is not like a path breaker the way you think she is in American poetry, because there is a lineage of women writers that you kind of can see that she's drawing from Kamala Das, and you can see that she's drawing from and is aware of Eunice D'Souza, even though they're, Kamala Das, we talked about this in the, we had another conversation about the other night where we talked about Kamala Das and Eunice D'Souza being, roughly contemporary, but like almost pulls apart, to me anyways, in their writing, like such a difference. But at least a commitment to kind of truth telling and kind of like openness and a kind of about the physical and about the body in particular. And Shreela certainly shares that. Mina Alexander's work is quite different in that even though Shreela also spent time in England, Mina was, Mina left India when she was 5 or 6 years old, and she was mostly raised in Africa, in Sudan. So she was in an expat community. Her work was very influenced by African writers. She herself often talked about her approach to the lyric and her fiction as well as being not necessarily in the Indian Anglophone tradition, but actually in the African tradition and not the Anglophone African tradition, because she was mostly consorting with French writers, Francophone writers, and Arab people who are writing in Arabic. And so she actually talked about her work being in the context of the Arabic, contemporary Arabic writing and contemporary Francophone writing, which I found very interesting. And then certainly, of course, her doctoral work was in Wordsworth and both William and Dorothy. And so I personally find in Mina Alexander's approach to the lyric a greater commitment to that kind of surface beauty. There's a tension between beauty and violence in Mina Alexander's work. I think Shreela leans harder into the darkness than Mina ever did. I think Mina there in Mina's work, but it was very much beauty was foregrounded, and the shadows, the darkness lurked in the shadows, so to speak. And that's not what you see in Shreela Ray, and it's not what you see in Ritika Vasrani, actually, which is another whole case. And certainly in Ritika Vasrani's work, you also have to, and in Shreela Ray's work, you have about the issue of mental health and the issue of the extreme alienation and extreme personal degradation that both of those women went through. Mina Alexander's heart, although she was marginalized, I think, in the community of contemporary American poetry for a long time, but she did in the end achieve some recognition. And she was always she was a professor at CUNY. She had a greater degree of access. Shreela was in the outer orbits of all of that, living out in Rochester, New York, felt were more or less cultural hinterlands, and she always bitterly regretted that she didn't have access to kind of the more cultural, the cultural center. And Mina Alexander was in the center of all of that, very cosmopolitan. Her husband is the brother of the publisher of the New York Times. She was intimately familiar with members of the Met. She was plugged in. Mina Alexander was plugged in. And a brilliant writer, but very different situation than what Shreela was dealing with and what Ritika was dealing with, even though, Ritika too, she had an MFA, she taught, she was married to Yusuf Komanyaka, but she was never really taken, she won the Barnard Women's Poets Prize. I mean, she was not marginal either. Ritika was not, but she didn't really have the time. She died when she was 42. She published 2 books while she was alive. Ravi, our colleague Ravi Shankar here, was responsible for publishing her 3rd collection posthumously, but there was no real chance for her to achieve literary success, and the circumstances around her death precluded anybody from taking her seriously as a writer, so the hope is we have Shreela's work, we can build a readership for her, which she richly deserves.
Absolutely. And in terms of what she was even able to create kind of in this what you have described as an intellectual wasteland, which she sort of felt.
I don't think it was. I don't think it is. Apologies to the city of Rochester, New York, but she felt, she felt she was on the outside,
Yeah. Yes. Apologies. Don't mean to put words in your mouth by any stretch of the imagination. But beyond that, I think there is something very interesting that I do think Shreela Ray achieved in the molecular society that we currently live in. And I want to talk a little bit about her relationship with Cornelius Eby and what she brought into her home and what leaves as a legacy even beyond that. I mean, at one point, it's quoted that Cornelius Eby sort of saw Cave Canem, what was born out of that, as a kind of lineage DNA strand with what was born in the salon of Shreela Ray's house. So it's really interesting, I think, to think about even the latent influences that we're seeing come out of Shreela Ray's relationships and her reading even today. So can you talk a little bit about the way she is absolutely a touchstone and in today's society?
I mean, if she felt alienated in Rochester, she really went out of her way to build community. She was sort of famously, she taught at Empire State College in Rochester, although not as a full-time professor, but she was famous among her students. She was always bringing them over to her houses. She was having these big dinner parties. And Cornelius Eady was one of her students, probably the most famous of her students. And he actually lived in her house for a while when he was a student, dorming with her and her family. And he's the one who wrote about those big dinner parties. And this is what he said. Shreela Ray had a great impact on the way I look at what you should be doing with your students. You go for a sense of community, like-minded people sitting around being really passionate about the things they really care about. And then later, referring to Cave Canem, which is the organization supporting African-American poets that he built with Toy Derricott. He said that Ray's house and those gatherings, those dinner parties, was one of the strands of the DNA that built Cave Canem. So it's this idea of an organization that existed solely for supporting poets. It was not Cave Canem is not an organization that was primarily made for teaching. It was not an organization primarily meant for helping poets to get published. It was literally about building a community of poets to be with each other. And Kundimon, which is the organization that now exists, founded by Sarah Gambito and Joseph Legaspi and others, that exists now, they claim Cave Canem as one of their forebears, that they felt they wanted to build an organization like Cave Canem for American poets. And so I feel like she is, godmother to that organization too.
And as Brother's use of godmother, and Tishani Doshi mentioned briefly that she saw Shreela Ray as a kind of goddess mother figure. And I think so much of that is something that Ray maybe establishes herself in her own work and my conversations with one another. She has, as you said, a very deep relationship to this kind of the way she comments on this feminine sort of wielding of feminine divine by in approaching this darkness to reckon with through almost a sense of divinity that she finds relationships with. In the poem Night in April, there is that line, "When the essence of things call me sister." And I think I want to talk a little bit about the way she establishes herself, even in her work, as a kind of Cassandra figure, and also as someone interrogating very deeply and metaphysically the world around her.
Yeah, I wonder, Rohan, if you have any. I don't want to talk too much. I wonder if you have any thoughts or comments.
No, I think you should go ahead. I don't have much, but yes, I do agree. That's a very sort of astute observation, and much of I think the answer is there in your question itself. There is the sense of awareness. But there's also this energy which is very community focused and kind of all encompassing. That's what I feel. It's deeply personal, but it's also radiating out towards the world in a way, in a collective sense. I don't know how she managed to do that, but there is that sense there.
Yeah, she's constantly kind of connecting herself or making metaphors. Like, I think of Emily Dickinson in particular as someone who does something like this. Like, I'm looking at this poem that Shreela has called Zero at 32, and it starts, "My life split in half and will not speak to each other. I myself am speechless. Each calls himself zero and hurls obscenities at the other in a language I understand." So she's like describing this internal psychological condition with this sort of dramatic metaphor of these two halves.
Yeah.
And what's also interesting is the two halves are masculine. They're him, they're he's. throughout. The blind one believes his eyes are at the back of his head, she goes on to say. And she, she continued, here's stations, but I am transformed into water. Look, I am at your Bernini calves. I am at your knees. So she's always kind of, this is the beginning of fern. Not that you change, but learn to bend like poplars, not in the wind only, but as if you heard music. So then it's like the you, who is the I, is a tree, is in the consciousness of a tree. So she's definitely like very, it's hard to explain, because when I think of the American poet that I would compare her to, Anne Sexton springs to mind, but she's mostly, the letters aside, she's mostly not writing these kind of first personal confessional poems about herself. Even when the speaker is I, Shreela Ray, it's a lot of it, it's like addressed to other people, like poem to my father or poem to Gawain, the son, And in the poems where the speaking I is Shreela Ray, they're not really narrative confessional poems. Like that one, those three that I read, they're more or less, they're little lyric poems, It's not like a narrative condition that governs each one. In that sense. So it's maybe like technique I would compare Anne Sexton, but not in terms of positionality.
Yeah, I think there's also a sense of always refracting the lyric I through something else. She's always trying to escape that kind of, because through the letters, we know so many of these poems are autobiographical. Because we've read the letters, we can tell, oh, this is what she's talking about. But sometimes I try to read these poems. If I had not read the letters, then it is not based on a private. It doesn't feel, when you read some poems, it feels like, oh, there is a private mythology there that the reader doesn't have access to. It somehow doesn't feel in her work. It feels immediately sort of recognizable. She's refracting. There is a Kafka poem, for example, the Asking for Water, which is from the letter, that Kafka wrote, which is brilliant. It's like how she refracts it through so many of her influences. Even the Hemant Kumar poem, there is a song, Hi Babu, so it's like she's doing, always feels like she's sort of escaping, pulling the ground beneath her feet like a little bit, always, where we don't really get a strong sort of like a grounding, which would make it a kind of a based sort of poem, which completely circles her inner space. So I feel like that is happening there so much with her works, that she was resisting this kind of she was always complicating, I think, positionality in a way in this country.
Absolutely. Yeah, I was thinking about Lady Lazarus to some extent by Sylvia Plath and her work. And I think that there is absolutely in the American tradition, there are very few people to compare. Even just that metaphysical voice that Ray takes on to at this period in time in poetry, which is just so phenomenal.
Yeah, I don't know. I cannot remember now if she mentions reading Plath or Sexton in her letters, but certainly that was exactly the moment. She was in school. She started school in 1960 and she finished in 64, and she published in poetry in 66. She might have even been in an issue right out. Sylvia Plath died in 1963. Is that right?
I think so.
Yeah. So, and then Sexton was also then there at that time too, writing and publishing, and winning her Pulitzer Prize right then. So I don't know that she talked about them in the letters. Sure, if she talked about them in the letters we chose, and I cannot remember. There were so many letters. So that would
in transcribing them, I didn't come across anything.
Yeah, that would be an interesting thing, though, to go back and look and see if there's any references. She talked about Robert Haas. She knew George Starbuck. She knew William Meredith. So there are American poets that she was mentioning and talking about as influences. And it would be interesting to see in the other letters if she talked about either Plath or Sexton.
This question of moving forward, what happens with the legacy of Shreela Ray now? This book is such an incredible collection in that it is more scholarship on her than was ever published in her lifetime. Just the very act of putting this book together was such a feat and such a incredible service to the poetry community in terms of bringing back this figure who so richly, rightly deserves to be here. What do you hope to see with the legacy of Shreela Ray happen now?
What do you think, Rohan? I know you have some ideas too about what you'd like to do.
I first of all, I'm hoping for more criticism for people, sort of, because it is an act of excavation, right? It is an act of bringing something and making it relevant in this historical time and period. And I think this time is ripe in a way for her to receive more critical attention. I think it is already happening. There are people who are. Sometimes I go and just put her name in the Twitter search and just look for, and people are talking about her. And there are some people who are just posting their entire, throughout the reading of 3 days, they're posting these poems because they're just struck by this voice, which has seemingly come out of nowhere. No one was aware of this, and there is this voice which is fresh, which talks to the immigrant experience, so well across cultures, and it's doing that thing. I can already see that happening, and so in that way, I feel, in a sense, that we have done the beginning of it, but also in a way, the beautiful thing about her is also that we can read her across against two traditions, right? One is the Indian Anglophone tradition, the global Anglophone tradition, and the Indian Anglophone tradition, and the American tradition. So it's beautiful in that way, and I hope that at some point in time we have an Indian edition, and I think that would be interesting because she did have an Indian edition, but it was Writers' Workshop, and Writers' Workshop did a lot of good work, a little indiscriminate sometimes in terms of what they published, but they published a lot, and she kind of I couldn't track down. I wrote to Writers' Workshop and they couldn't track down a copy. So it's completely sort of, I think, bringing her back into the conversation would be so interesting to just see how the Indian poets react to it. And the cost is so prohibitive in terms of buying in India that, it's impossible to ship this. But I think an Indian edition would create this new strand of criticism, looking her against the Indian Anglophone tradition, and she was not completely out of touch. She was in touch with Jayanta Mahapatra, another poet from Cuttack, where she was born, and Jayanta is still alive. He's very, very frail, and he's in his late 80s or 90s, but he's alive. And I actually wanted to write him about her, but he's really not in a position to, I think, receive any form of but I think it would be very interesting to kind of have her and to just see how the Indian poets react to it, because Tishani looks at Shreela in a very different way, then and I think I see so much potential in that, in having her be read in the Indian Anglophone tradition too, a place, and I also hope a literary tradition that she somehow longed for. I mean, there isn't clear. She was very aware of being invisibilized in the American, poetry scene, of course. But I also wonder, because that there's that letter she writes to the publisher of Writers' Workshop, and she says, I don't want another issue. I don't think anyone's waiting for my work, which is another way of, which we cannot take it for face value, right? Like, she's obviously feeling something else when she's saying that. So I think that is my second step of extending this. I think is looking for an Indian publisher.
Well, that would be amazing, and I think you're 100% right about that. In terms of what's there, there was the book her book, Night Conversations with None Other, which mostly was all included in the Indian publication from Writers Workshop, although I think the title was different. She also constructed a second manuscript that had the title Maggie Behaves Worse Than Expected. And although she never finalized it, but it's there. Multiple versions of it exist in the papers, in the archives. There is also a 22-page long poem for her younger son, which is really like about her garden and about like all of that kind of, life with him and everything. And it's called Counting Cats.
Yeah,
and
it's
then
a lovely.
yeah, Rohan really loved it and wanted to put it in this book, but the page count became complicated, and we tried various different ways of excerpting it. We tried to say like, oh, let's just do it, and it didn't work. It just didn't work, It's
also a very eco poem in a way where there's so much praise of gardens, which was her lifelong sort of obsession.
Yeah, so there's that, and then there were also about 30 poems that were published. Her husband, Hendrik, published these little pamphlets after she died, each with 5 or 6 poems in them. And then there was about maybe 100 or 150 pages of unpublished poems. So there's a lot of material that could be put together. And also, I think as a writer, her letters are so rich and so incredible. So I could see the future bringing like a collected poems of Shreela Ray and maybe a collected letters, or a bigger selection of both than we were able to do in this book. So hopefully there's more coming with Shreela Ray.
Well, I believe this is all the time we have for today. And I'm so excited for this possibility of more books in the future and more Shreela Ray in the future. And I'm just so grateful, Kazim and Rohan, for such a beautiful conversation. And thank you, Ravi, and IAAC, and everyone involved. And I'm going to turn it back over to you. And
thank you, Caitlin.
Thank you.
Thank you, Kazim.
That was so rich. Thank you all. And of course, this is the Unsung Masters series. One of our imperatives to support. And so there you go, a whole triptych of books there. So I hope that you will go out and support this publication. And of course, there's a lot of great programming planned for the IAAC Lit Fest. Karthika Nair, Marilyn Hacker, Priyanka Champaneri, Sanjana Satyan, and a number of others. In fact, my own book, Correctional, is I'm talking to Yale professor Caleb Smith. And so there's rich stuff all week. And it has been such a pleasure to host the three of you. Thank you so much. And everyone, hope you stay safe and see you next time. Bye.
Bye.